Poddy the Modumanthe. Written by Veronica Garden. Narrated by Sasha Louise. Dedication. For Veronica and Khalil. Chapter 1. The Villagers of Dumperton. This story is about Poddy the Modumanthe, a creature that no one has yet managed to describe accurately, though I will now try. Poddy is about 5 foot tall, bright pink, furry all over, walks like a human and has a large belly. Her face is a bit like a monkey, but she has a tail like a cow. Poddy is a rare creature. She is the last Modumanthe left, and so lives amongst the humans, alongside other mystical friends. They have all been categorised as harmless to humans, at least as harmless as humans themselves. She lives in a little cottage in the village of Dumperton, decorated inside with sparkly mosaic that she made herself. Poddy has a friend called Scribble, who is a mouse-like animal, but is the size of a cat. Scribble is always scavenging for food and money, although he doesn't try to get things for free from Poddy. This is probably why they are still best friends. Everyone else gets a bit fed up with Scribble, and they try to avoid him, which is sad. Poddy shares what she can with Scribble, and Scribble shares what he has scavenged, but only with Poddy. It seems to be a special arrangement between the two friends, and they get on well because of it. Everyone loves Poddy because she is so funny and kind, and they just don't understand why she spends so much time with Scribble. But they are usually together, so when people want to spend time with Poddy, they put up with Scribble. That is how much Poddy is liked. Poddy loves mosaics and makes them all the time. It's Poddy's job. If anyone wants to decorate anything with a mosaic, they call Poddy. She makes the most beautiful and sparkly mosaics with all sorts of objects that she finds for free. She sees it as recycling and making other people's rubbish into beautiful things. Scribble actually helps Poddy to find the most interesting rubbish, which is another good reason why they get on so well. The people that live in their village don't mind Scribble taking their rubbish. They actually find it quite useful. It's only when he pinches food or money that they get annoyed. Scribble swears that he only takes money that he finds in the rubbish, like coins stuck down the side of a chair. He admits he takes food out of the rubbish too, but they don't mind that. But some people have sworn that their snacks have gone missing from their cupboards. Scribble says they have just forgotten what they have eaten. Dumperton, the village that they live in, is right next to the sea. Poddy can't swim and is afraid of falling in the water. Scribble can swim but doesn't like doing it very much. They visit the beach a lot because there are many shells, stones and worn-down, sparkling green and blue glass pebbles on the beach that Poddy and Scribble collect for Poddy's mosaics. Poddy stays away from the water, just in case. Scribble likes to get his feet wet and paddles in the shallow water, staying on the edge so Poddy can see how far the water has come up from the beach, so she can stay away from it. In the same village lived a wicked troll called Cottage, who ate cottage pie all the time, because, he said, there was nothing else to eat. The only other things he liked to eat and destroy were Poddy's sparkling mosaics. He didn't need to. They weren't very nutritious or sweet. He just did it to be difficult. Anyone who had got Poddy to make them mosaics had to protect them from Cottage. Chapter 2. The Chicken Wall. Mr. Foster came to see Poddy in the twinkling cottage, as he was thinking of building a garden wall instead of a fence. He wanted Poddy to make the wall spectacular with her mosaics. The clients usually came to Poddy's cottage to see the different types of mosaics they could choose from for their particular design. Mr. Foster chose an interesting combination of sparkly sea glass and shells with tin rubbish. And he wanted it done as quickly as possible, as his fence had blown down in the wind and his chickens had to be locked up in their coop until the wall was built to keep them safe. This was a bit sad for the chickens. Poddy immediately sent Scribble off to gather some metal from cans and such like, while she went to the beach to gather the glass and shells. Normally, Scribble and Poddy would do this together, but because of the order of tin rubbish and the urgency of building the wall for the chickens, Poddy decided they would collect materials separately. Scribble found some tins in a bin belonging to the Minster family. The Minster family loved baked beans, and Scribble knew that they usually would have some tins. Everyone used to laugh about the Minsters and make jokes about all the beans they ate. They made lots of fart jokes, but also jokes about recipes with beans. It wasn't just beans on toast, but bean pie, bean summer pudding, and bean custard, bean tart, bean sponge cake, etc. If you got invited around to the Minsters for tea, you knew what you were going to get. Most people didn't mind it as it was only for one day, but the Minster children, Tommy and Sally, had bean recipes every day. They didn't seem to mind, though. They never complained. Despite the Minster family being sure to have tins, it wasn't as simple as it sounds. Being a cat-sized mouse, Scribble had to drag each tin back to the cottage one by one, so it took all day, even though the Minster family had an entire bin full of baked bean tins and he didn't need to look elsewhere. Poddy would then cut and shape the tins and take the pieces to Mr. Foster's garden in a wheelbarrow, which was a lot simpler than all that dragging about. Poddy, meanwhile, went to the beach with large buckets and a spade and was busy collecting glass shapes and pretty shells and stones. Poddy had a vehicle to help. It was a tricycle with a large basket at the back. She would fill up the buckets and place them in the tricycle and cycle them back to the cottage to wash the shells and stones and polish the glass. This day seemed no different, except Scribble was busy collecting the bean tins and wasn't there to make sure Poddy didn't go too close to the water. But Poddy seemed pretty confident to keep out of the water by herself and kept looking up at the tide to make sure it wouldn't touch her toes, which, by the way, are short and stubby. Poddy was walking along the beach and went to pick up some sea glass with her spade. But instead of scooping it up like usual, this time she found more glass underneath. It was like a treasure trove of sea glass all in one spot. Poddy believed that most sea glass was made from wine bottles, with sharp edges polished away by water, stones and sand. This discovery looked as though it had been made from a bottle the size of Poddy herself. She kept digging and pulling up more and more glass, filling her buckets, which she loaded onto her tricycle. She was just filling up the third bucket when she looked up and suddenly realised that water was swirling around the other side of the trike in a low channel of sand. The water was rising, and Poddy had nowhere to go. If only Mr. Foster hadn't been in such a rush, Scribble would have been there to help and spotted what was happening. Poddy started crying, and then the crying turned into wailing. Kittak the troll was walking by, but just laughed. Everyone in Dumperton knew that Poddy was afraid of water. He said mockingly, "I'm so hungry. It's a shame I can't get through the water to your buckets for a snack." But this did at least stop Poddy wailing and decide she had to do something productive. She quickly scanned the road along the beach and spotted Tommy Minster eating some seaside rock and twirling himself around the road fence. She called to Tommy, who was a well-behaved but farty child. "I'm stuck, Tommy, and I can't swim. My bike, my buckets and me are all stuck on this sand island and the tide is coming in. Can you help? Can you get someone to help?" Tommy nodded and ran off to get help. He ran home, which was not far, and found Scribble by the bins. He explained everything that had happened, and Scribble dropped the tin in his mouth and ran off to the beach. Tommy told his sister Sally and his mum and dad, and then he ran on to tell Mr. Foster. They all ran down to the beach to see what they could do. The water wasn't very deep yet, but Poddy was far too scared to cross the water. They needed to make a bridge from something, and make it quickly, and really they wanted to save the trike and buckets of sea glass too. Tommy said, "What about a door? We could prop up a door and Poddy can cycle over it." "Great idea," said Sally, "but where are we going to get a door from?" Just as she said that, the man from the seaside rock shop, Mr. Popplerock, came out and said, "You can use my door. We just have to get it off its hinges." Mrs. Minster and Mr. Foster ran over to help Mr. Popplerock get the door off its hinges, while Mr. Minster, Scribble, Tommy and Sally kept talking to Poddy to keep her calm. They carried the door down to the beach and laid it over the channel of water that was swirling around Poddy. Tommy and Sally ran over the door to Poddy and started pushing the tricycle whilst farting, which was like rocket power. Poddy was able to get on the tricycle and ride over the door to safety. She was so relieved. She said she would never be in such a rush again to go to the beach without Scribble to keep an eye on the tide. Mr. Foster and Mr. Minster helped to lift the door back up from the sand so that Mr. Popplerock got his door back. Mr. Popplerock then gave everyone a free stick of rock to make everyone feel better. Kit-Ak had been watching everything and laughing, and was really annoyed that everyone that helped got a sugary stick of rock. He swore that he would have helped if he'd known he'd get a treat, and kept asking for some, but Mr. Popplerock said no. Kit-Ak was so fed up that he snatched a handful of sea glass from Poddy's bucket and ate that instead. Everyone was so shocked that he stole it, but he ran off so quickly they couldn't tell him off. Mr. Foster thought the whole thing was his fault, as he had rushed Poddy to make a mosaic wall for him. But Poddy said it didn't matter as she was safe now, but he could always help them make the wall if he felt badly. He said that he would be very pleased to help. The next day, Poddy, Scribble and Mr. Foster built the wall. Poddy showed Mr. Foster how to make it sparkly and colourful with the glass, shells and tin. When it had dried, he was able to let the chickens out of the coop, and they were so happy running around. Kit-Ak was watching, hungry. He wanted to take a bite out of the wall. Mrs. Minster saw Kit-Ak and quickly made up a bean cottage pie to fill him up so he would leave the wall alone. She told him he was very naughty, but she didn't want him to be hungry. He actually said, "Thank you." Though it was in a grumpy voice, it was more than Mrs. Minster expected. She gave him a wink and a smile. She always hoped that Kit-Ak would become nicer if people did good things for him. She thought for a minute that maybe her good deed had worked. Chapter 3. The Cafe Wall. Poddy's next commission was for the local cafe. The owner, Mrs. Potwash, wanted one of her walls decorated in mosaic with china and pottery. This was harder to source from rubbish bins, so Poddy sent Scribble to ask Mrs. Tattlebury at the local charity shop, Bits and Bobs. When Scribble turned up, they thought he was scavenging and looking for freebies, and they were very grumpy towards him. Scribble explained that he only wanted to keep any broken china and pottery that they would otherwise throw out. Mrs. Tattlebury said this was fine, as it saved it from going in the rubbish. They gave Scribble a huge basket of broken china that they had ready to throw out. Poddy had to collect it in her tricycle. Kit-Ak was watching, as usual. He was contemplating whether to eat the china or wait for the wall to be decorated and nibble the wall in the coffee shop. Poddy was in her workshop, smashing the broken china into smaller pieces for the mosaic. She took the pieces to the cafe. The wall she was working on was sectioned off so that people didn't get grout and dust all over them and in their food. Poddy's mosaic was going to be in the image of a giant coffee cup and plate. Scribble was mooching around, trying to get a free piece of cake from Mrs. Potwash. He was successful, but only because they were making something in the cafe. Otherwise, Mrs. Potwash would have sent Scribble away. For the top part of the mosaic, Poddy had to climb a stepladder and hung 2 buckets from it. On one side the grout, on the other the china pieces. Scribble was at the bottom of the ladder, weighing it down and eating cake. Although it didn't need to be weighed down, the stepladder was well balanced. But Kit-Ak had a plan to cause trouble. He sneaked off and collected some mice, the size of mice, rather than Scribble, who was the size of a cat. He put the mice in a basket and smuggled them into the cafe under his cloak. Mrs. Potwash hadn't seen. No one saw. Everyone knew that Kit-Ak was trouble, and everyone knew that he was at the cafe, probably to cause trouble. But he had bought some tea and some cottage pie, and so they thought he was behaving himself. He waited for Scribble to move away from the stepladder for a bit and then released the mice. The mice stormed straight for the bottom of the ladder because Scribble had left a lot of cake crumbs there. There were 24 mice, and they all climbed on one edge of the ladder and it started to wobble. Poddy panicked and tried to balance the ladder by leaning the other way. But the mice suddenly all jumped off and Poddy was left leaning too far the other way. The stepladder fell and the china and grout buckets spilt all over the floor. No one had seen that it was Kit-Ak that brought in the mice. But now he bounded over and said, "I'll help you clean up this mess." He chomped up all the grout and china before anyone could stop him. Mrs. Potwash actually thanked Kit-Ak for cleaning up the mess, whilst Poddy was rubbing her sore head from where she had fallen and bumped it. Poddy had a sneaking suspicion that Kit-Ak had planned the whole thing, but had no proof, so could not say anything. Poor Poddy and Scribble had to go and collect more china to finish the mosaic. This time they went to the local restaurant, Chompers, and asked if they had any broken crockery. Luckily, they had a bin for smashed crockery and it hadn't been emptied yet. The plates in Chompers were pottery, not china, but they had been painted by a local artist, Miss Feather, so were delightfully pretty, even when broken. They went back to the cafe, but Poddy was more careful this time. "I think Kit-Ak planned the whole disaster to get some china to eat for free. This time we have to catch him and prove to Mrs. Potwash that it was his fault and not ours. And stop him from succeeding, of course," said Poddy. Poddy set up the stepladder, but put bricks at the bottom to weigh it down, and told Scribble not to be greedy and have any more cake. The mice had gone now, so they wouldn't have that trouble, but Poddy was sure Kit-Ak would plan another surprise attack, especially when he came back to the cafe and asked for cottage pie for tea time. Kit-Ak was thinking of another plan to topple the ladder and buckets, but couldn't think how to do it and make it look like he was innocent. Scribble wasn't eating cake, so the same plan would not work. The ladder was also weighed down with bricks. He needed to make someone walk into the ladder this time, a big person. The bigger the better. Unfortunately, there were no giants in this village. While Kit-Ak was still thinking, in came Mr. and Mrs. Minster with Tommy and Sally. They were sick of eating beans today, and for a treat got to come into the cafe and order anything they liked, as long as it didn't have beans in it. They ordered their food, but it was quite busy in the cafe, so had to wait quite a while. Kit-Ak could see that the children were getting bored, and he whispered to them, "Why don't you go and say hello to Poddy? She looks sad all on her own on that ladder. Why don't you cheer her up with a ladder game?" The children were surprised at Kit-Ak's suggestion. They thought he was being really kind, and they thought it was a good idea. They ran up to Poddy and started to climb the ladder, singing the Grand Old Duke of York nursery rhyme. The ladder started to wobble, and Poddy thought, "Oh no, not again!" But quick as a flash, Scribble saw what was about to happen and jumped on the ladder to balance it in exactly the right place. Poddy told the kids to stop what they were doing, which made them sad and start crying because they thought they were being good, cheering up Poddy. Scribble came down the ladder and asked, "Why on earth did you start doing that?" Sally and Tommy explained that it was Kitak's idea and that they were only trying to help cheer up Poddy, who looked lonely at the top of the ladder. Scribble said, "You have been tricked by Kitak. We knew what he was trying to do and we just needed proof to tell Mrs. Potwash. We must tell her." So they all told Mrs. Potwash, but she said it sounded like Kitak was just trying to help, and if anything had happened, it would have been an accident. She said there just wasn't enough proof to throw Kitak out of the cafe. Meanwhile, Kitak was annoyed his plan hadn't worked and his tummy was rumbling, despite the cottage pie that he had eaten. He got so fed up he got up and stumbled over to the ladder himself. He said, "I don't feel well. I have tummy ache." As he said it, he rubbed his belly with his big troll hands and knocked the ladder with his elbow. The bucket with grout started swinging backwards and forwards until it snapped and fell from the ladder. It turned upside down and landed on Kitak's head. "Yum, yum," he said, though everyone knew he preferred china to grout. Mrs. Potwash saw the whole thing and decided that Kitak probably had planned the whole thing beforehand and threw him out of the cafe, saying, "You are banned until the mosaic is finished and dried, and even then I don't want you nibbling on it." Kitak took the bucket off his head and stumbled out of the cafe, muttering to himself. Chapter 4. The Bench in the Park. The next project for Poddy was a bench in a park. The bench went all around a tree. The villagers wanted the bench to be a mosaic, and the parish council had paid for Poddy to make the bench beautiful. The bench had been finished, but someone had been nibbling at it, so it needed repairing. The original design had used bottle caps, so Scribble was sent off to look through the recycling bins for these. He was very successful and gathered plenty to do the job. Poddy and Scribble presumed that Kitak was the one responsible for nibbling the bench and wanted to make it Kitak-proof. This time they planned to put a varnish over the bench. They had discovered that Kitak did not like things that taste of varnish and usually left things alone if they used it. Kitak seemed to never be far away when Poddy and Scribble were working, and he overheard their conversation. "Yuck!" he exclaimed. "I will never be able to nibble at my favourite bench again if they use varnish." Kitak went straight to the do-it-yourself shop, Nuts and Bolts, and said to Mrs. Screws, "I have a project that requires all your varnish, please." Mrs. Screws was surprised, but Kitak had asked so nicely, and even said please, that she wanted to help him. "OK," she said. "You can have all the tins that I have left in the shop. That'll be 12 tins. It will cost you £60, Kitak. Have you got the money?" Kitak said that he had the money. He'd saved it for a rainy day, and he decided this is what he would like to spend it on. Later on, Poddy went into Nuts and Bolts and asked Mrs. Screws for tins of varnish. Mrs. Screws was very apologetic and said that she had sold all of her varnish to Kitak. She realised that she had been tricked, as everyone knew that Kitak was always trying to ruin Poddy's plans. She said, "I'll have some more varnish by next week if you can wait until then." Poddy didn't like waiting. When she had a job, she liked to finish it as soon as possible, and she had other jobs she had promised to do afterwards. But now she was stuck. If she finished the job without varnish, Kitak would just nibble it again. Poddy went to see Kitak and said, "I hear you have a project and needed all the varnish, Kitak. Do you mind me asking what your project is?" Kitak grumbled, "I haven't got a project and it's none of your business, Poddy." Poddy suddenly had an idea. "I really need that varnish, Kitak. Is there something that I can make for you, for your garden, for half the tins of varnish? Maybe your own bench?" Kit-Ak was excited. He hadn't thought about having his very own bench to nibble on, in his own garden. That would be super. "Yes, please," growled Kit-Ak. So Poddy sent Scribble off to get even more bottle caps and started work on a bench for Kit-Ak. It took a whole day, but it was better than waiting a week for new varnish. She arranged the bottle caps in such a way that the bench was covered in pictures of Kit-Ak's face. Kit-Ak was so pleased that he handed over all the tins of varnish. "I don't need them now I have my own bench. Ghastly stuff. Tastes very nasty, even though it looks like syrup," said Kit-Ak. "Yes," said Poddy. "You should never eat varnish. It's a bit like glue. But then most people don't eat mosaics either, and you seem to love them." The next day, Poddy went back to the park and completed the bench around the tree and managed to varnish it all over. Now it was Kit-Ak-proof, like all the villagers wanted. She stuck some signs up around the bench saying "wet varnish" until it had dried out, so no one would sit on it and get a sticky bottom. Meanwhile, Kit-Ak was happy at home, nibbling on his own bench without varnish. Happy, at least for a little while. Chapter 5. The Cinema. Poddy's next job was actually a bus ride away in the nearest town, Diddlebury. There was a cinema there, and they wanted a display to brighten up the cinema. Mr. Vision, who was the cinema manager, lived in Dumperton and knew about Poddy's beautiful creations. He asked for a large archway for inside the cinema that people had to walk through. He thought that it would be lovely to have something impressive at the entrance, and something that people would like to take photos in front of to share with their friends. Diddlebury was a seaside town, so Poddy had decided to make a mosaic of seaweed imagery all over the archway. So that meant lots of curly shapes, twisting in every direction. It was a very pretty design. Poddy couldn't use actual seaweed in the project as it would rot. Also, Poddy wanted it to be shiny and sparkly, as the cinema is all about stars. Not stars as in stars in the sky, but the famous actors on the cinema screen that are also called stars. Poddy decided that the inside of a washing machine would be a lovely metal to use, all shiny with holes in. It would also use up old washing machines, which would otherwise go to a huge rubbish dump. Scribble was sent around all the houses in Dumperton to ask if anyone had a broken washing machine that they wanted taken away. They were lucky. A handful of families had left out old machines in their gardens and hadn't had them collected. They thought Scribble was being a nuisance, but they changed their mind when he said they would take their washing machines away. The machines were heavy, though, so Poddy had to ask for help from Mr. Foster, who had a small tractor that could lift heavy items. Mr. Foster was happy to help. He took the machines to Poddy's cottage, and she had a special type of blowtorch that could melt metal with its blue fire flame. She could use the torch to cut out and bend the metal into sheets. She could then cut the pretty shapes of seaweed out. Poddy had nearly enough metal, but she could really do with one more washing machine. Scribble said that Kit-Ak had one, but didn't want to give it to Poddy unless there was something he could have in return. He liked living with junk in his garden. Poddy thought hard. What could she give to Kit-Ak? She'd already made him a bench to nibble on. "What would you like, Kit-Ak?" said Poddy. "I'd like to be a film star for a day," giggled Kit-Ak. Poddy wondered how on earth she could do that, but she promised Kit-Ak that she would, to get the last washing machine. Kit-Ak agreed, because he knew Poddy always kept her promises. Now she had 2 jobs to complete. While she worked, she was thinking of a plan. She contacted Mr. Vision, who agreed to her plan. She was going to make a film about Kittak and release it at the cinema. There would be an opening day where he could attend the cinema as the main star. He would love all the attention. Mr. Vision said it could be the same day that the seaweed mosaic arch was unveiled, and photographers would be there to take photos for the local newspaper. Kittak could stand in front with Poddy as she made the arch. This would make Kittak feel even more like a star with all the flashes from the cameras. Mr. Vision knew that Tommy and Sally were interested in making films and had video cameras. And he had a friend called Ted Chop who could edit the film together. He said, "You'll probably need an editor to edit all the bean farts from Tommy and Sally out of the film." Tommy and Sally agreed, and Kittak was so excited. Tommy and Sally followed Kittak around all weekend, filming him doing anything and everything. Kittak started doing things just because the camera was there. He started climbing up high and jumping off things to be like an action hero. Tommy and Sally were laughing, but Kittak swore that he always did things like this and it wasn't just for the camera. Scribble thought it was fun to watch and followed them around whilst they were filming. But Scribble suddenly smelt a pie coming from a nearby bin. He crawled in to get the pie. But the bin had a special lid and Scribble got trapped. Scribble squeaked and squeaked, "Save me!" Tommy and Sally started filming the bin. Kittak bellowed, "Don't worry, Super Kittak will save you!" Normally, Kittak would have laughed and walked away. But as he was pretending to be an action hero, he thought this will make him look really good. He tried putting his hand in the bin, but that didn't work, so he ripped the lid off the bin and reached in, grabbed Scribble and lifted him up to the sky in one hand. "You are safe because of me!" exclaimed Kittak. "You're my hero!" giggled Scribble happily. "That's a wrap," said Sally, who thought that is what film directors say when they finish a film. Ted Chop found it very easy to edit the film in a way to make Kittak look like a star and an action hero. Meanwhile, Poddy had finished the archway. The night of the film opening, she visited Kittak and gave him a suit that she had got from Mr. Vision. Mrs. Screw picked up Kittak in her nice new black car and drove him to the cinema. As he arrived, Mr. Vision had Poddy and Scribble in front of the arch, ready for their photographs. But Kittak strolled in and held his big troll hands in front of their faces every time the newspaper photographers took a picture. He wanted to be the only star tonight. They watched the film, which was really good. It was really funny too. It wasn't supposed to be, but everyone was laughing at Kittak being a hero instead of a bad troll. They especially laughed because just when Scribble said, "You're my hero," to Kittak, there was a long farty noise over the top. Ted Chop held up his hands and said, "Nothing I could do about that one." Tommy and Sally blushed. Kittak would have been furious, but he had enjoyed being a star so much that he decided to laugh instead. "Phew," said Poddy. "Job complete." The end. You have been listening to Poddy the Modumanthe. Written by Veronica Garden. Narrated by Sasha Louise. Copyright 2021 by Veronica Garden. Production copyright by Veronica Garden.